In this series of videos, we are going to talk about complex numbers. Complex numbers are on a different plane than the coordinate plane that we're used to. So on the coordinate plane that we're used to, we have two axes. We have an x-axis and we have a y-axis. So we have a horizontal move, a vertical move. One is called x, one is called y. Right, so let me just draw this real quick. Okay. We have an x and we have a y. And on that x, some number, y, some number, we have an ordered pair. Complex numbers can also be plotted, but they are in an entirely separate plane. This is a real plane. So real number plane. This is the complex plane. And the two are not mixed at this stage of your mathematical career. In fact, these two will not mix likely until you get to much higher level math, calculus above. So the complex plane, you've got a horizontal move, which is your real number. It's the real part. And the vertical move is your imaginary part. And we don't write this as an ordered pair, we write this as A plus BI. So A is your real number, and just the B is your imaginary move. So with that said, let me show you for an example. Let's do 3 minus 5i. So 3 minus 5i. So the real part, A, is 3. And the imaginary part, negative 5i, gives us B equals negative 5. So we would go right 3, 1, 2, 3, right 3, and we would go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this point right here, that point represents 3 minus 5i. So it's that simple. Hopefully it gives you an idea. We've got our real part, let me just write that down here, our real part, and we have our imaginary part. Okay. So I must like 3's and 5's because I have 3 plus 5i graphed in the upper right hand corner. And again, we've got our complex number, A plus BI. You've got a real part that is completely separate from the imaginary part. Now, what is I? I is the square root of negative 1. So I is the square root of negative 1. And we're just going to call that I. So whenever I see a square root of negative 1, I can replace it with I. I squared is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which is negative 1. I cubed is I squared times I, and I squared is negative 1. I'll use my highlighter here. See, I squared is negative 1, and I is just I. Negative 1 times I is negative I. I to the fourth is I squared times I squared. So I squared times I squared. I squared is negative 1. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So what you need to remember is this part right here. You need to remember that I is equal to I, which comes from the square root of negative 1. I squared is equal to negative 1. I cubed is negative I to the fourth is 1. So I have a nice little pattern. I've got I1, I1, I1. I1, I1, the two in the middle are negative. And that's how I remember I to the first, I to the second, I to the third, I to the fourth. So that's going to help us when we start multiplying things together. But until we get to that multiplication, let's just talk about adding and subtracting. When you add and subtract complex numbers, you combine, you collect the real parts together, and you collect the imaginary parts together. So in this case, I have real part of 4, a real part of -8, and I have a real part, an imaginary part of +5i, and an imaginary part of -2i. So no surprise, 4 plus -8 is -4, and 5i plus 2i is 7i. And that is our answer. Now when we subtract, we need to subtract, let's just go back to my favorites here. When we subtract, we need to subtract the entire complex number, which means we're going to be distributing that negative sign. So -3 plus 2i remains, but then we're going to have -4 plus 4i. -3 minus 4 is -7. 2i plus 4i is +6i. And our answer is -7 plus 6i. And here we are with the multiplication. 3i needs to be distributed to -3 plus 4. 3i times -3 is -9i. 3i times 4i is +12i squared. Remember that I squared, I1, the 2 in the middle are negative. I squared is -1. And if you don't already remember that, you're going to remember it probably pretty easily here because it's a common imaginary number times itself. -1, we use it all the time and you'll see that. -9i minus 12. The only thing is the real part always comes first, so we rewrite this -12 minus 9i. So you're thinking, well, would it be incorrect if I left it the other way? Yes, it would be. The real part always comes first. Okay, so go ahead and try and maybe if you'd like to, you could FOIL this if you'd like to use this as a try. Otherwise, you can follow along with me. I'm going to FOIL. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times I, so my first is 6. My outer is 3i. My inner is -8i. And the last is -4i squared. Now remember, this I squared is -1. So I've got 6 minus 5i, 3i minus 8i is 5i, and then -4 times -1 is +4. So the real part always comes first. 6 plus 4 is 10 minus 5i. Okay, if you'd like to try the next one, maybe you didn't try that one and you want to try the next one, I would encourage you to do that. Our first terms, 36, -6 times -6. The outer is +6i. The inner is -6i. So the outer and the inner combine to be 0i. They cancel out. And then the last is -i squared. And remember that I squared is -1, so minus a negative is a positive. So 36 plus 1 gives us 37. And that is still a complex number. We can consider that a complex number. It's just that the imaginary part is 0. And whenever you have 0 times anything, you know that you don't have to write it. Now if we get something like this, 4 plus the square root of -36 times 2 minus the square root of -9, you must convert. So you must change to i's first. So you have to change to i's. So I like to say you have to take out an I. Once I see that negative underneath that square root, I take out an I. So I've got 4 plus I times the square root of 36. 2 minus, this negative comes to the outside, and that's an I times the square root of 9. Now the square root of 36 is 6, so this is 4 plus 6i. 2 minus 3i. The square root of 9 is 3. And when we multiply this out, my first term is 8. The outer is negative 12i. The inner is positive 12i. That cancels out. And then I have negative 18i squared, which would be positive 18, which is equal to 26. Now we're going to come back in the next video and we're going to do a little bit of division.